This video is going to be a brief overview of the ontological argument, which is one of the classic proofs for the existence of God, and it's my personal favorite idea of all time. And I'll explain at the end of this video why it's my favorite idea of all time. If you're new to my channel, Truth Unites, I describe it as a mixture of theology and apologetics with an irenic focus. That word irenic means aiming for peace. It's really important to me because of the deconstruction and polarization in our culture, trying to build bridges where we can. Now, for me, that doesn't mean that I never give arguments for my view or critique another view. It has more to do with how we do that. But I do want to be sensitive to not kind of overdo that. And I've done a number of videos lately criticizing Catholic and Orthodox views, and I'll continue to do that, but I don't want to only ever do that. I also want to celebrate what we have in common and do work in apologetics. I have a book coming out next month called Why God Makes Sense in a World That Doesn't. So next month being October of 2021, filming this in September. And that's really important to me, and it's something I want my YouTube channel to be about as well. The algorithms reward you more for narrowing and also for things that are more controversial, but I really just don't want to go down that trail. I really want Truth Unites, my channel, to be more positive and celebratory as well, and with a focus on apologetics and making a basic case for God and for Christ as well, the things that all Christian traditions have in common. So, in that spirit, I want to go over what is my absolute favorite idea, what I think is a fascinating argument. I'm going to go over Anselm's version of the ontological argument. I'll give a brief overview of it and then go through a couple of objections and then explain my kind of what I find valuable in it at the very end of this video. This won't be comprehensive. We won't cover every objection, but hopefully it'll be a good introduction. So this argument comes up from Anselm. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on Anselm, and this is a translation of his writings that I often recommend from Thomas Williams. It's a great translation. And it's in chapter 2 of the Proslogion. And I'll basically just really try to summarize just the bullet points here for the sake of this video. There's sort of three movements in this section in the Proslogion that I've detected. I've spent a lot of time reading through that book. It's my favorite book of all time, Anselm's Proslogion. And so first he comes up with this very ingenious definition that really drives not just his proof for God's existence, but everything he believes about God and the whole rest of the book that he uses to prove the entirety of God's nature. And it is that than which nothing greater can be thought, which is a kind of a mouthful of words, but it's so important to get that right because later versions of the ontological argument, like Descartes, for example, will reduce that to just the greatest possible being or a maximally great being, something like that. And they have to face a criticism that Anselm can just skate around, namely, can you conceive of the greatest possible being? Is that a logically coherent idea? Anselm doesn't even have to get into that because he has a more of a negative definition, that than which nothing greater can be thought. And that's carefully worded so that you don't assume that you can think of it, okay? So that's important. So that's the first thing. He offers this definition for God, that than which nothing greater can be thought. Then second, he distinguishes between existence in the mind and existence in reality. He says we can all have the idea that than which nothing greater can be thought of a being that is like that in our minds. And that's different from it existing in reality. And then he gets to the crucial movement, which has sparked so much discussion and can be summarized real briefly here. Sorry for the paper ruffling here. I got to make sure I read this right. This is not Thomas Williams. This is an older translation. Sorry for that. It's what I have in front of me. And certainly that greater than which nothing can be thought cannot exist only in thought. For if it exists only in thought, it could also be thought of as existing in reality as well, which is greater. If, therefore, that than which nothing greater can be thought exists in thought alone, that than which nothing greater can be thought turns out to be that than which something greater can be thought. But that is obviously impossible. Therefore, something than which nothing greater can be thought undoubtedly exists in both thought and reality. Now, so a lot of words there. In the Latin, it's clunky, but hopefully you can catch the idea. He's saying that there's something about the very idea of God that once it's Once you see it is in the mind, you see it must also be outside of the mind. Otherwise, that than which nothing greater can be thought is not that than which nothing greater can be thought. Something greater can be thought. Now, the immediate response that many people have is to kind of laugh this off as though, I remember the first time I ever heard this argument, I was sitting at the airport reading this book, Philosophy of Religion, Selected Readings, great little book. And I was just learning how fun philosophy can be. I was a junior or senior in high school. And there's an article in that book by Alvin Plantinga on a modal version of the ontological argument. I remember that was my reaction. I thought, oh, come on, you can't actually argue for God's existence like that. But then the more I thought about it, I couldn't figure out why. And to this day, I think the argument actually can be articulated in a variety of ways that are formally valid and have sound premises, have true premises that entail the conclusion. So this is what Bertrand Russell said. He said, basically, it's much easier to sort of dismiss the argument, and he disagreed with the argument, to be clear, than it is to say why it's wrong. Because even though it feels like some joke is being pulled on you or some trick, you're being tricked in some way, because there's this counterintuitive movement from existence in the mind to existence in reality, it's really hard to say why the argument doesn't actually work. And it's just amazing. So the philosopher Schopenhauer said that considered in daylight, the ontological argument is just a charming joke. And lots of people have that reaction. But there's lots of other people who, and here's Russell himself. So Russell himself, when he was a university student, tells this really funny story. He says, basically, I had gone out to buy a tin of tobacco and was going back with it along Trinity Lane, which is in Oxford. I can picture where this was, when I suddenly threw it up in the air and exclaimed, "Great God in boots, the ontological argument is sound." I just so funny thinking of Bertrand Russell throwing the tobacco up in the air and saying that. Such a British phrase there. But that is what many people, the ontological argument, and I'll get into this at the end of this video when I talk about its value, it has this kind of revelatory quality to it. One thing that's interesting is it was occasioned by an intense spiritual experience during prayer. And my book on Anselm is all about, it's a commentary on the Proslogion, and it's all about the full argument, not just the argument for God's existence, which is just the first step in a much longer process, whereby Anselm uses that phrase, that than which nothing greater can be thought, to prove everything we believe about God, and then to prove God is the fulfillment of the deepest longings of the human heart. And many people have talked about the ontological argument like this, where they'll have that kind of revelatory moment, like Russell. And I would say, again, my favorite idea, I've had moments where the ontological argument can open up new ways to consider the very nature of God and even the very nature of thought. I'll come back to that. But let me just say, for those who are tempted to dismiss the argument too quickly, it's worth saying at least this much, that some of the greatest minds in the history of Western philosophy and some of the most brilliant contemporary philosophers take this argument seriously. And that's enough right there to at least take it seriously enough to try to articulate why it's wrong, if it is wrong. So with that said, let's cover two of the main responses that are given. The first is probably what is the most instinctive response that you see at the street level, or when people first encounter it in like a philosophy class in college or something like that. I've taught a little bit on Anselm, so this comes up. It's always fun to teach on and see people's responses to it. And this would be, one way of putting it is how it was articulated in Anselm's lifetime by a contemporary monk named Gaunilo, where he posited a lost island, or what do you call it? The island of the blessed, the island than which nothing greater can be thought. And he's basically doing a reductio kind of argument, trying to show, look, if this argument works, you could prove that anything exists by just making it that than which nothing greater can be thought. Here's one contemporary articulation of this concern.
Well, first and foremost, and arguably the most important objection, was put forward by a contemporary of Anselm called Gaunilo, who pointed out that by simply replacing the term greatest being with greatest island, you can prove that there must be a greatest island, or a greatest beer, and so on. Effectively, Gaunilo used the technique of reductio ad absurdum, more commonly known as reduction to the absurd or appeal to extremes, to demonstrate this flaw in Anselm's argument.
To state briefly, the problem with this response is you cannot take any finite object and just insert it into this phrase, that than which nothing greater can be thought. When people give this response, what it shows, I think, is that the actual concept under consideration has not yet been grasped. So if you take an island, for example, that the island than which nothing greater can be thought, there is no such island, any more than there's a number than which no greater number can be considered. There's always a greater number. Any finite object is going to have a greater possibility you can always consider, because the qualities that go into making the greatness of an object, like an island or any finite object, have no intrinsic maximum. You can just keep on making it bigger and bigger or better and better, and so on and so forth. A being, by contrast, that than which nothing greater can be thought, you're talking about the great-making qualities like knowledge and power, and those do have an intrinsic maximum. You could be all-knowing. You could be all-powerful. So what this objection ultimately fails to notice is the qualitative difference between God as that than which nothing greater can be thought, an infinite being, and any finite object that you try to put into that formula. Okay, here's another objection that's often brought up. This is probably the most weighty objection historically, and that's from Immanuel Kant, who said existence is not a predicate. And this is in his Critique of Pure Reason. Now, I think I've spent a lot of time working through Kant's text for various papers I've written over the years. And I'm pretty convinced that he's often misunderstood, and that there's a lot of confusion about this sentence. What does that mean? So a predicate is basically, in a sentence, everything but the subject. Grammatically, that's usually what it means. So if you said Anselm made an argument, the predicate is made an argument. And some people have taken Immanuel Kant as though he's basically saying you can't ever predicate existence of something in any sense. But obviously, he's not saying that. Obviously, you can predicate. Like you could say Santa Claus doesn't exist. Or you can say the city of Washington, D.C. does exist. You can obviously say that and make an argument for that. I think what Kant is saying is existence is not a predicate in the sense that it adds something. Okay, it's not it doesn't add anything on to the subject that is being predicated. So here's how he puts it, for example, at one point. He says, being is evidently not a real predicate. So note the adjective real there. That is, a conception of something which can be added to the conception of some other thing. It is merely the positing of a thing or of certain determinations in it. So people who criticize Kant as though he's saying it's absolutely not a predicate, like not even a grammatical predicate, I don't think are getting his argument. I think if I were to distill down what he means, I think what Kant is saying, to just abstract from a lot of other thought and put it briefly, existence is not a great-making quality. Existence is not something that if you predicate it of a subject, it makes it any greater. So, for example, he uses the metaphor of $100. Here's how he puts it, Kant himself. This is from the Critique of Pure Reason. He says, the real contains no more than the possible. 100 real dollars contain no more than 100 possible dollars. By whatever number of predicates, even to the complete determination of it, I may cogitate a thing, I do not in the least augment the object of my conception by the addition of the statement, the thing exists. Now, I've thought about this a long time, and I'm continually convinced that that is just not the case. Existence is a great-making quality. I would say, think of it like this. There's different kinds of greatness. We could distinguish between qualitative greatness and quantitative greatness. So quantitatively, it's true that $100 that's real is not quantitatively greater than $100 that exist only in your mind. It's not greater than 100 imaginary dollars in the way that $101 is greater than $100, right? It's not greater in that sense. But qualitatively, in a more wholesale, summative way, obviously it's greater because you can buy something with it. Obviously, if something is posited to exist, that makes it greater in some sense. And the being, than which nothing greater can be thought, must instantiate every kind of greatness. Otherwise, the being that did that would be greater than it. So obviously, if you posit that God exists, that being is greater than just the idea of God. I really don't see, and there's passages I found in Plantinga and others who basically say Kant was kind of confused. This is one of those things that's interesting to see how influential something can be, despite when you press into it. Because I've spent a lot of time reading through Kant, and I don't think he's saying anything more than that. Like the actual section in the Critique of Pure Reason is really brief. It's just a couple pages, and yet it's had this massive influence. So the history of this argument is Anselm articulates it late 11th century, and then it's sort of revived by Descartes and a number of other philosophers. And by the way, Kant was not dealing with Anselm's version of it. He's only dealing with a version of Leibniz's argument articulated by Christian Wolff. So there's all these different ontological arguments. Kant never interacted with Anselm's. Anyway, so there's the revival of the argument by Descartes and other modern philosophers. And then Kant's objection that existence is not a predicate pretty much carried the day for a while. It gained widespread acceptance, and then there's a revival of the ontological argument in the 20th century, especially since like the 1960s. And people like Plantinga and so many others, John Hick and Norman Malcolm and so many others have kind of revived this argument. So it's interesting to see the history of it and how influential Kant's objection was, even though it doesn't actually have a lot of substance, unless you say existing in reality doesn't make you greater in any sense. So I would say that Anselm's argument is both valid and sound within the context of his presuppositions. So I add that within the context of his presuppositions because there are presuppositions that are required for the argument to work that I think are very reasonable, but someone could challenge them and you need to then address those challenges. They're not themselves established by the argument. So one would be that existence, just as we talked about, existence in reality is greater than existence in the mind. If someone challenged that and said, no, existence in reality is not, people could challenge that based on the word greater there. And they could say being, Anselm has a kind of Platonic or hierarchical conception of ontology or being. Someone could challenge that and say, no, ontology is just on one plane. There's just one grade of being. And so people could, and then you need to address that. But I think the argument actually works. And the more time I've thought about it, the more I think, yeah, it seems like kind of counterintuitive to think, but it's really hard to say what in the world is wrong with this argument. And what I would say is, for me, despite that, I don't think the main value of the argument is convincing someone, because it is such kind of a bizarre way of thinking. I think the main value of the argument, or at least the way that I can say for me and for what I suspect many will find, is just it's not in proving that God exists, but the main benefit is in just elucidating the nature of God, showing what we mean when we think of the word God. And then I would say, just for me, just how fun an idea can be to think about. I think it's the most interesting idea you can imagine. And I would say one way to summarize kind of the import of the ontological argument would be to say the necessity and uniqueness of God bombards us at every level of our existence, including the rational level. As soon as you start thinking about what he is, you realize it's absolutely impossible to even imagine that he doesn't exist. You can't. There's no possible universe in which you can even imagine how that would work, because of the nature of what God is. And I would say, so in other words, God bombards us at the intellectual level just as much as the level of conscience or any other level of our existence. And that's the great focus of my book on Anselm. I remember to write this, I read a lot of the French and German literature on the proslogion, and it is amazing how much there is a disconnect, and the English language literature is doing something different, and the French is doing something different, and so forth. One of the things a lot of the French literature draws attention to is that this argument really does tap into a kind of existential place in the human mind and in the human heart. One of the texts I remember used this phrase to describe the proslogion. It says, this is a book that touches upon the secret, silent desire of humanity. And I'll never forget thinking, how interesting that a proof for the existence of God would do that. But that's exactly what Anselm does, and that's why the whole book is in the form of a prayer. It comes in chapters 2 through 4, but chapter 1 is a lengthy invocation to see God, and then starting off in chapter 5 of the proslogion, he says, okay, what then are you, that than which nothing greater can be thought? And he uses the same formula to unpack and unroll everything about his faith. And then the consequence of all that is God is infinitely satisfying to the human heart, and that's where he ultimately gets, which I think is pretty fascinating, kind of trajectory of thought. So I love the proslogion. I'll probably talk about it again sometime. That's just a brief overview of this one part of it, namely its proof for God's existence. I'm curious what you think in the comments. Do you think it's a sound argument? What do you think is the main value of the argument? I think it's, if nothing else, it is one of the most ingenious little argument, and its enduring quality shows that. People who just dismiss this argument as obviously kind of silly, or like Schopenhauer saying a charming joke, they have to find some way to explain its durability. Why do so many serious, intelligent philosophers take it seriously? They also have to give an argument for why it doesn't work. And a lot of times when you press into the arguments, you put it down on paper, conceptually, you get it down to, into a logical syllogism. It's really hard to show where the problems are. I think the most vulnerable spot would be the definition of the word greater. I think that's really where you need to provide more of a defense. But I think a lot of the typical objections really don't touch the argument. So I'm curious what you think. Hey, thanks for watching. God bless you.